Hello and welcome to France 24's Talking Europe. I'm Luke Brown. This week we're looking at something that has changed the way we live our lives here in Europe, the terrorist threat that has killed hundreds of people in the past decade. Paris, Brussels, London, Manchester, Berlin, Strasbourg, Nice, the list of cities struck by terrorism in Europe sends a shiver down the spine. Preventing new attacks is the top priority for EU member states, security forces and their intelligence agencies. And our guest, Gilles de Kerchove, is the EU's Counter-Terrorism coordinator and is at the heart of that European cooperation. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
If we can start here in Europe, you've been in the post currently since 2007. That's a decade where terrorism has struck pretty much every single Western European state. What lessons have been learnt in that time?
That we have to get more Europe involved, and that's what we've done, at least a lot more since 2015, the attack in Paris. And when you ask people where they would like to see more Europe, any polls would show security as a top number one concern. And I think the message went through. The President of the Commission, the President of the European Council got the message, and they've decided to create what they call the Security Union, appoint a full-time commissioner, Sir Julian King, and do a lot more in many directions, reinforce the repressive response, do more in the preventive response, and engage a lot more with all our neighbors, from Morocco to Turkey, including the Western Balkans. And we've done a lot of progress, I think.
In 2017, which is the last figures we've got from Europol, 9 EU states said that they'd suffered or reported a total of 205 foiled, failed and completed terrorist attacks. That's actually up on the previous year by 45%. Does that mean that Europe is getting better at preventing attacks or just finding out about attacks?
Usually I define in the following way. I think the threat is still very serious, more complex because more diverse than it was before. But at the same time, we have reduced significantly our vulnerability. So if you define the risk as a combination between threat and vulnerabilities, we are probably doing as before. What we see is a lot more plots or terrorist attack by lone actors than and less project mounted from Syria and Iraq, where Daesh was sending people in Europe. So a lot more difficult to spot, because you need to first identify those who are at one stage of radicalization. But even more difficult, you have to determine what I call the tipping point, when someone who is radicalized starts preparing something. And that's why you have to interrupt the plot.
On a broader question, do you think the EU is focusing too much on Islamist terrorism while ignoring the threat of far-right terrorism? The German authorities say they've seen far-right extremism grow by 50% over the past 2 years.
True, and Christchurch in a way is a bit a wake-up call, and we have started working on it. I'm about to release a report on the subject that we will discuss under the Finnish presidency. But it's not at the same scale, of course. Ultra-right or far-right terrorism is fortunately a lot less developed than Al-Qaeda or Daesh-related terrorism, if I may call it.
And the Islamic State organization, as we know and you've touched upon there, is losing its territory in the Middle East. Can Europe expect there to be an uptick in the number of threats and the number of attacks in the coming years? You've talked about Daesh 2.0. What do you mean by that?
The risk, if this is not properly addressed both in Syria and Iraq, that we see the same causes producing the same effect. You may remember when the Americans withdrew from Iraq in 2011, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was nearly completely destroyed. 3 years later, only 3 years later, Baghdadi proclaimed the caliphate in Mosul, attracting more than 40,000 fighters from more than 100 countries in the world. So why was it possible? Partly because the then Prime Minister of Iraq had a very sectarian policy against the Sunnis. And that led many tribes to support the extremism Sunni organization, which became Jabhat al-Nusra and Daesh, instead of supporting the new state, the post-Saddam Hussein state. And currently, it is very important for the Iraqi government, as well as for the evolution, the political solution in Syria, that the Sunnis find their place in the two states. Otherwise, I think it will happen again. That's one. The second one is the physical caliphate has collapsed, but we still have the virtual caliphate. You can still find on internet a lot of Daesh content, which keeps inspiring people in Europe. So we have to address both.
You mentioned there the foreign fighters and the virtual caliphate. Approximately 6,000 EU citizens joined the Islamic State organization. Many have been killed or captured. But what do we do about those that do still exist and are still alive and could potentially return to Europe? Because as EU citizens, it is their right to return to the EU. How do we prevent a further attack?
First, spot them at the border when they return, and we have made a lot of progress in this respect. We now have a systematic check on EU citizens when they cross the external border of the European Union. Second, share more information, and there is a significant change in the way member states do populate and do use the many databases that we have. And be prepared to try these people and have the adequate legislation, the proper procedure in court, access to evidence. We are working to collect battlefield evidence in Syria and Iraq, and the proper system of risk assessment and disengagement program in prison. So that's one side. On those who are detained in northern East Syria, for the time being, member states don't want to have an EU firm harmonized policy. But the trend is to see them prosecuted and tried in the region. And informally, we are exploring whether it would be possible to have them tried in the region. A possibility, but still need to be further discussed, is whether we could rely on an hybrid court in Syria. But that's up to further discussion with the Iraqi government.
The French authorities are basically allowing 11 French citizens to be tried in Iraq, and they've been condemned to death. They're not doing that much to change that. And also the issue of judging people and trying people in Europe is very complex, because in the UK only 10% of returning jihadists and combatants have been able to be facing prosecution because of the possibility of not finding sufficient evidence that will stand up in court in European courts. How do you get around those problems? Is it easier
I already mentioned one, which is try to get better access to battlefield evidence, and something that I've already discussed with the Iraqi authorities is to digitalize and index all the data collected by the Iraqi army, the security service there, the special force. So that's one. The other one is to have the proper legislation. In some of the member states, just participation in a terrorist organization is in itself a crime and would lead not to 30 years in prison, but many years.
Now, the return of extremists to Europe does raise the question once again of what went wrong to allow the radicalization of so many men and women. And places like Molenbeek in the Brussels suburbs are crucial. One of the most deprived places in Belgium. It was home to the Abdeslam brothers who took part in the 2015 Paris attacks. France Van Katz, Mohamed Farhat and Clovis Kazali visited Molenbeek to see what has changed to improve life there.
Since the Paris attacks of 2015, Molenbeek is often linked to terrorism. The last surviving attacker, Salah Abdeslam, grew up here, right next to the town hall.
Bonjour.
Molenbeek's new mayor, Catherine Moreau, wants to turn a page and improve her neighbourhood's image. Erase the automatic assumption it's a home for radical Islam.
In fact, there's a tiny minority of people who made big mistakes. But the others here are extremely good people who deserve to have just as many chances in life. They deserve just as good a future as anyone else. So defending and restoring Molenbeek's image is really about giving them a bright future.
The socialist mayor believes arts and culture can be key in ending the stigma, and that Molenbeek has much to offer, with emerging young artists who already have a following.
We put on shows that bring together all kinds of audiences, local and regional. Every time people congratulate us and thank us for our welcoming attitude. They say they didn't know Molenbeek and didn't think it would be like this.
The European Regional Development Fund has spent €300 million since 2007 on developing and revitalizing the area around the canal. But according to this security expert, it will take more to mend what some have labelled a haven for jihadists.
The situation has improved in Molenbeek, or at least in part, thanks to large sums of money spent in the area around the canal. But you can't change in 2-3 years what is the result of 30-40 years of inaction.
The area and its 100,000 residents is only a few kilometers away from the European institutions. The contrast is stark. 40% of young people in Molenbeek are unemployed. That's twice the national rate.
Now, we've touched upon this issue earlier in the show, but the de-radicalization programs in Europe do have a major task in front of them. Are they up to that task? Do places like prison not just serve to continue to fuel extremism?
True, it remains an incubator of radicalization. I would not use the word de-radicalization as such, because that means change someone's ideas, and it's very challenging. But what is important is to disengage first, so to convince someone that they cannot use violence to impose his or her ideas, and then reintegrate the person when it will have served his or her sentence. One of the big challenges these days is what to do with those who are leaving prison because they have served their sentence and are still highly radicalized. And the European Commission has supported different programs. One, to improve the assessment of the risk in prison so that you spot signs of radicalization properly. The other one is to support disengagement program.
Moving on to the question of what to do with the EU nationals and the families of some of the combatants that are still in the Middle East. 566 children are thought to have been born to Western Europeans. How can Europe help those families, and especially the children, from coming back without risking creating a future generation that is radicalized?
Well, as I've said before, member states do not want to have a common harmonized EU policy in this respect. One of the challenges is the issue of whether you can bring a child without the mother, because the intelligence community is of the opinion that more and more mothers are highly radicalized. We know that Daesh has invested a lot in the women, in the mothers, in order to, let's say, prepare the next generation of the caliphate. And therefore, building on very highly radicalized mother, they hope that the next generation of the cups of the caliphate will be active. And so there is a concern in many member states to bring a lot of women back. So is it in the best interest of the child to bring the child with not bringing the mother as well?
Looking slightly beyond the EU frontiers itself, and especially to North Africa, the southern front line, it's called. 7,000 of the 50,000 or so foreign fighters in the Islamic State came from North Africa, especially Tunisia, Morocco and Egypt. And many of those people and places do have links, and strong links, to Europe. What's being done on the cooperation level with those states to prevent a flow of potential?
A very good question. I was some days ago in Tunisia for this very reason. We try to help Tunisia to digest the possible return of their own foreign terrorist fighters. They need a lot of support in what we've just mentioned, disengagement program, prevention in prison, and so on. So we do work with Tunisia a lot. We do the same with Morocco, and Morocco has quite effective program on radicalization in prison as well. But I believe we need to do a lot more.
You mentioned earlier in the show the virtual caliphate. Another element, really, of the 21st century terrorism is the ability for people to become radicalized online. The EU is preparing a new law to crack down on extremist content online, hoping to force social media platforms to take down doubtful content as soon as possible. How will that help protect European citizens? Will not people who want to get their information out there, will they not just be able to get around these new laws?
First, we have started with a sort of voluntary approach with the internet companies, the Silicon Valley companies, so that they themselves develop the necessary tools not to upload in the first place, and they use more and more artificial intelligence to prevent the upload of any extremist material. We have then developed at Europol an internet referral unit, people specialized to spot what is unlawful, what is terrorist content, and what is just free speech. We may not like it, but that's free speech. But then we thought it was not effective enough, and that led the Commission to suggest a draft legislation where an obligation will be put on all companies to remove unlawful content within an hour. And if they don't abide by that, they may be subject of a sanction which may be up to 4% of the turnover of the company, which is for some of this company a lot of money. I hope the new parliament will adopt this legislation very soon, because we really need to decrease the huge volume of unlawful content on the internet.
Okay, and one final question on technology. Now about the debate about how to implement 5G or fifth generation mobile technology. Recently, a European memo was leaked warning about the concerns that 5G technology will upset current police surveillance techniques. How big a threat do you think that is, 5G is, to traditional police surveillance techniques such as wiretapping? And how do we work around it?
I'm the one who drafted the memo you refer to. It's just to warn member states on the need to work a lot more and more quickly on the standards, which will define how to deploy 5G. To make it very short and very simple, we want to avoid backdoor for, let's say, China, which is one concern, but we want to keep front door for lawful interception, i.e. what currently the security service and the law enforcement agencies are doing when it is foreseen by law and authorized by a judge. Just monitor conversation, get access to metadata, and so on. And one of the challenge here is that 5G will be so important, connected car, remote surgery, smart cities, that the system will have to be extremely robust, but not so robust that it will no longer possible to intercept communication.
Gilles de Kerchove, thank you very much. That's all we've got time for in the show. Thank you very much for participating and asking in great detail all of our questions. And thank you for watching. More news and headlines after this short break. Do stay tuned to France 24.
Move to the rhythms of Africa. The Africa Cup of Nations from June 21st until July 19th on France 24.